Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Regional Housing Council. Today is Wednesday, November 13th. The time is 4 p.m. and we're going to go ahead and get started. As always, maybe we'll just start with a quick round of introductions. Michael Althauser, City Council member from the City of Tumwater, and I believe I am joined or will be joined by Brad Medrud from our planning department. I also expect Councilmember Joan Cathy to join us as well. Carolina, do you want to introduce yourself and folks?
Yes. Hello, everyone. Carolina Mejia, Thurston County Commissioner and alternate. And then joining me today, we have Tom Webster, Elisa Sparkman, Rob Gelder, Alex Pierce, and Leah Tangeman. I think
Awesome.
I got
Thanks.
everyone.
Yeah, Carolyn?
Hi, Carolyn Cox from the Lacey City Council, and I'm joined by our planning manager, Ryan Andrews. And don't know if anybody else is going to come on, Ryan. Do you know? Okay. So we're the Lacey crew today.
Great. Thank you.
And
Danny?
Hi, all. Danny Madrone, the Olympia City Council, and I'm joined by Robert Vanderpool and Darian Lightfoot.
Awesome. And I see Gary. I see you here. I'm not sure if the mayor might be on the other screen. I don't know if I see him yet.
Yeah, so Gary Cooper, Planning and Building Manager, City of Yelm, and I do not know if the mayor will be attending.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, everyone. So I don't believe there are any changes to the agenda. So moving right along, our first order of business is just approval of the meeting minutes from our October 23rd meeting. Is there a motion to approve the minutes?
move approval of the minutes.
And is there a second?
Second.
Motion by Councilmember Cox and seconded by Councilmember Madrone. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, motion passes. Thank you. That brings us to public comment. I don't believe we have anyone registered for public comment yet or at all. Is that right, Leah?
That's correct. And then we have 3 attendees, so they can raise their hand if they would like to speak for public comment.
Leah, could we move Jen Freiheit into?
Yes.
Thank you.
And no hands raised.
All right. Last call for public comment. Raise your hands if you would like to participate. I'm not seeing any. All right, we'll move right along. The next item on our agenda is our 2025 legislative priorities. Tom, I think you're gonna brief us for this, and Carolina, I believe you'll be helping facilitate this, as I'll be abstaining from the discussion and the vote on this one.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Thank you. So I'm gonna share my screen. So we talked about our last meeting, we talked about the legislative priorities and had a good discussion, and you asked that we came back and we put those together and looking to take formal action tonight to approve these priorities. So as a reminder, the 3 that were agreed upon last meeting were support for preventing unfair and extreme rent increases, so rent stabilization. Second one is around funding for the governor's rights of way initiative, making sure that funding continues. And then the third one was funding for Habitat's 3900 Boulevard project. I did want to point out in your packet, we had a description. We got some additional information this morning from Habitat for Humanity on that. So we've just added, and we can send this out later, but there's just been an update on the total cost of the project, and what's already $14.5 million has already been secured, and Habitat submitted a housing trust fund proposal for $4 million, and they're planning to pursue a congressional appropriation of up to $5 million if necessary. So we've added that to the description for this item. So those 3 were talked about at the last meeting. At the end of the last meeting, Councilmember Madrone brought up the idea in the previous last year's or the 2024 priorities There was an item around capital funding for the Housing Trust Fund, including creating a dedicated source of Housing Trust Fund revenue. That came up at the end, and it was decided there wasn't time for discussion, so we were asked to kind of put that off for further discussion at this meeting. So would like to have a discussion on whether you want to include that as a fourth priority for this year. And then the last is we had a lot of good conversation around the idea of whether bringing up something related to mold and moisture, given the presentations and public comment last week, was appropriate. There was a feeling towards the end that since we didn't have a specific policy request, that not to include it as a priority, but something that should be worked on in the coming year. So what we've done is we've called it an additional area of interest, and stating that this is an area where further work is needed, but the RHC calls on the state legislature to take action to explore practical options for increasing protections for households impacted by conditions of mold and moisture in housing. So not a formal priority, but we wanted to honor the conversation that happened kind of at the last meeting. So we thought that, wanted to include that, but happy to, take your direction on if that's something you want to include or not. So with that, open it up for, happy to take any questions or further discussion.
Thank you, Tom. Any questions?
I'm supportive of everything as sorry, I didn't raise my hand. I just kind of jumped in there. I do think it would be a good idea to add the Housing Trust Fund, especially given the nature of our work as the RHC. And I'm fine including mold as an area of interest. It might flag the attention of a legislator who already had some ideas or maybe wants to work on something this session or next session. I will note, can you scroll up to the top, Tom? Just noting that minimum wage is $16.66 an hour by the time legislative session will start. So just one edit right there to just update that.
Great, thank you. We will make that. We'll make that update.
Thank you for catching that. Okay. Any additional questions? If there is not any additional questions, are we ready to approve?
Sure, why not?
I was looking at you, Carolyn, just making sure. Okay, so is there a motion?
All right. So I would move to approve the legislative priorities list as presented.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Any discussion? Okay, hearing none. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay, anyone against say nay. Okay, hearing none. The legislative priorities are approved. Thank you. Handing it back to the chair.
Thank you. Appreciate that. So let's go ahead and move on to item 5 on the agenda. That's our 2025 draft communications plan. Lisa, I think you're going to help us walk through this one.
Yeah, thank you. So my name is Lisa Sparkman. I'm the communication specialist for the Regional Housing Council, and I've put together a draft communications plan for 2025. And last year I presented a 2024 version, and this plan really builds off of the 2024 plan. And so I'm going to kind of skip the background info here. The 2024 plan laid a lot of foundation. And so this past year, we've kind of developed some, I would say, some basic kind of protocols and procedures for how RHC communication works. And so the plan for 2025 is to kind of continue that work. And so I'm going to go ahead and just skip ahead to the kind of the work plan part of this. So the projects for 2020, oh, I got to change that to 2025. I forgot to update that. I'll put together, with the assistance of the tech team, a 2024 annual report of the RHC's work. There's an example here. You can click on that in your packet to see what we did for the 2023 report. and continue to develop and implement an email newsletter for, and that's something that we were hoping to get done this year, but it kind of had to be put on hold we're waiting for the newswire software still, or the newsletter software still at the county level. So that I am still waiting on an update, but I think that may be happening soon. But the goal is to have a quarterly newsletter, and hopefully we'll be able to put it out by the end of the first quarter next year. Each year, I kind of present a social media review, what we've done, how things are going, and make a recommendation to see if we need to change anything about how we manage social media as with the RHC branded content. And another project that the tech team has been working on is expanding the RHC website. And the tech team put together a spreadsheet kind of the affordable housing incentives available throughout the different jurisdictions. And so we have the product complete, but now we want to put it into a website form so that it's more of a more navigable for affordable housing and housing developers in general. So, and potentially this project could include new ideas for expanding the website. And I've been working on putting together a communications manual for the RHC so that this position that I have as communications specialist has a manual for somebody to step in the event that I'm not here. So, and then create the plan for the following year. So it's a pretty simple plan for next year, similar to the one we've done this year. And the plan has implementation kind of a guide for how the things get done. Tech team works on them together. I kind of lead that, and then get reviews from content experts and from the RHC chair and vice chair. And so that is the plan. And if you have any suggestions or questions, I can take those. And then just to let you know, we don't need a formal approval for this, just kind of a heads up looks good because it's kind of a living document. So.
Great. Does anyone have any questions or comments or feedback they'd care to offer?
I have just one thing. I clicked on the 2023 report and it doesn't open for me. I don't know if it works for others, but it does not work for me.
I'll send out an updated link if that one doesn't work for others.
Thank you. I also actually do have another question about the implementation piece. The list of government partners and stakeholders. Is that something, so like right above that where it says step 1, draft 1, that's something that needs to be developed, right? That's like part of the plan is developing this implementation piece?
No, this is the process for creating content,
Okay.
developing it and reviewing it. So this is just so the draft 1 is done by communication specialist, by me or the content expert. And then the tech team kind of reviews and works on it together, and then to create a final draft, and the final draft is presented to the chair and vice chair.
Okay, perfect. So that's separate then from what I was wondering about was the government partners and stakeholders, particularly the homeless population. And I was wondering how you're connecting with that population.
So this piece is the different kind of communities that we may be communicating to. And so it's part of recognizing who our audiences are. Mm-hmm. And so far, that's as the RHC, not just for, this plan itself. So this like broadly the communication of the RHC, these are the people who are the RHC's partners and stakeholders. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. I'm wondering like specifically how the homeless population is engaged. just because they're kind of a population that typically doesn't have access to conversations like this. And so I'm wondering like how we're engaging with the homeless population to ensure that their voices are actually at the table.
So I think like, I guess Tom or someone else might want to chime in on this, but I would say through our lived experience steering committee, homeless services advisory board, affordable housing advisory board, the new processes that we're using in our system to build off and listen to voices of lived experience. I would say, and that's how we're engaging as a system at this level. But in terms of like direct outreach, I wouldn't quite know how to answer that.
Okay, no problem. Thank you.
Great. Any other questions or thoughts to share? Feedback?
Yeah, I'm sorry if this is awkward, but I'm going to request if Commissioner Klaus has any questions that she please put them in email format for staff, as she is not representing the Regional Housing Council for Thurston County at this point.
Okay.
Well, I think you've done a great job with the plan. It looks solid to me. So
Thank you.
shall we bless it?
Yeah, I think this looks great. There's a lot of work in here, but I think it's really going to help us really get the message out and be clear about the projects we're working on and different funding resources that we're making available to the community. So I think this is great. Which we don't have to take a vote, but I think this is typically where we do a thumbs up if we indicate if the plan looks good. All right. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. That then brings us to agenda item 6, the 2025 request for proposal, the RFP. Tom, are you going to help us walk through this one?
Yep, I will. Thank you.
Great.
So I'm not going to share my screen, but so you do have in your meeting packet a draft calendar for RFP. So this is really just prepping you for really next month's discussion. So our meeting in December is going to be heavy on the RFP. So right now the advisory boards are working on finalizing their priorities, the scoring criteria, their application questions. And so this is giving you a heads up on what to expect for next month. And we're really moving up the process by about a month. Typically in past years, we have issued our RFP in mid to late February, with applications due at the end of March, early April. This year, we're moving that process up to allow us time to draft all the contracts that are going to be required so we can bring those to our county commissioners for approval before the end of June. So our schedule this year is in December, we'll be bringing to you the recommendations from the advisory boards on those criteria. As a reminder, this is a big year RFP. All of our 2-year awards that were made in 2023 will be coming to an end. So we'll have our full amount of funding that we anticipate awarding. So this will be a large RFP. We're also in the past, we have typically done what we've called a consolidated RFP, where we've combined our affordable housing application and RFP with our homeless services into one RFP and one application process. This year, to kind of honor the work that each advisory board is doing, we are separating those out, though, so there'll be a separate RFP specific to affordable housing projects and a separate RFP specific to the homeless services project, as well as a separate application for each of those as well in Zoom grants. So we'll be bringing those to you at your December 11th meeting. We'll then be going to the Board of County Commissioners in January to get approval to issue that RFP. And then looking to bring the RFP and make that live January 17th. Some of that is dependent on the commissioner schedule. I've reached out to Amy Davis of whether the commissioners will be actually doing any business on January 7th. We may need to push that back a little bit before we get their approval. But we are looking at then having applications due at the end of end of February, with the advisory boards doing their work to review and score those applications in March. And then again, in the past, and we'll kind of jumping a little bit into the next agenda item around the schedule. In the past years, we've asked you to move up the RHC meeting to the second Wednesday in May to make those funding recommendations. This year, we're going to ask you to move up the schedule and do that the second Wednesday in April, so that then we have kind of the months of April and May to prepare those contracts to bring to the county commissioners for final approval. The other thing I wanted to kind of give you a heads up on, and we're still learning more information. One of the challenges this year is by moving up the calendar, we are going to be a little challenged by knowing exactly what our funding amounts are from the state. You know, with the state legislature, we are anticipating, we've been given a heads up from Department of Commerce that it is possible that we will receive a reduction in funding from the state under the Consolidated Homeless Grant. So they're telling us to prepare for that now. We won't know what that looks like for a little while, but we are looking at a possible reduction in our state funding for this year. So more information as we get that. But I think that will be one of our challenges this year, is not trying to kind of thread that needle of making our best estimate of what funding we're going to make as we're making funding decisions in April, but perhaps not having the final budget from the state at that time. So we will navigate that as best we can, but more to come next month, but wanted to kind of prep everyone in advance of that discussion.
Great.
And I see Commissioner Mejia.
Yeah, go ahead, Carolina.
Thank you. I have a question in regards to, is there any flexibility in terms of the Board of County Commissioners schedule? I'm seeing January 7th, 2025, and not sure when our first meeting of the year is going to be, looking at Rob for that. And then also looking at the last day for BOCC approval of the contracts in terms of when we're going to have summer break. So as we're working just through that scheduling, Tom, if you will let the clerk of the board know, and or Rob, let them know.
Yeah, I have reached out to the clerk of the board and confirmed that, because I know whether that January 7th, whether I'm following the same schedule the board had last year. I don't know if that's going to change. That was that June 17th as well. I don't know if you'll follow the same summer schedule, but we will certainly, yes, kind of finalize those dates and make any adjustments as necessary.
Okay. I don't have any questions, but I do certainly have a lot of gratitude for the staff and all the work that goes into putting this together. It's going to be a big year and a heavy lift, but we're always very appreciative of the work and the time and the effort that goes into this. And a future thank you to our advisory boards too, that do a lot of the lifting as well before those recommendations come back to us. Does anyone have any other questions for this one before we move on? Great. We are moving right along. We're so ahead of schedule. That brings us to the 2025 meeting schedule item. Tom?
Yeah, so just
which we've already sort of talked about.
We've already talked about, right? So we just included in your meeting packet, so you can get those dates on your calendar. We will also send out updates. The biggest change, as I noted, is really that April meeting. I'm looking to do that April 9th, so we can bring those funding recommendations to the board. So again, if we need to slide a little bit, because of, just the not being able to get the RFP out at the beginning of January, and we need to give applicants a little bit more time, we will come back and visit that. But our hope is to be able to do that April 9th, because it is going to take us a good 4 to 6 weeks to draft all those. There'll probably in the neighborhood of 50 to 60, 70 contracts that we'll need to draft. And so those will need to be done by the end of May. So we will need the time to do that. So looking to make decisions at that April 9th meeting. And then again, similar to this year, pushing the November and December meetings to the second Wednesday of the month to avoid the Thanksgiving and Christmas holidays.
Yeah. Carolyn?
I was just going to say, maybe as a back pocket plan B, that perhaps we pencil in 2 meetings in April, just in case we can't quite make the April 9th. So
Yeah,
that,
Mhm.
so that the last Wednesday is reserved on our calendars as well, if we need to push it. And then we could cancel the meeting on the 9th if we need to.
You
What
mean
is
cancel,
everybody-
like we would we would aspire to finish by the 9th and then cancel the subsequent meeting if we would need to.
Yeah,
So we can
Yeah.
put both on the calendars and then.
I think we
cancel the
could.
second.
I think we could also just play it by ear, unless are there notice requirements that we would be in violation of if we had to decide that on April 9th, that we would need more time?
I think we can manage those. We can post a notice of cancellation. We can figure out those details. I don't think that prevents us.
yeah. It's just that calendars tend to fill up pretty fast, so I like to put holds on mine so that I don't get booked into something else.
Danny, did you have a comment on this specific question or a different comment?
Oh, different comment.
Okay. Do you mind if we wrap this one up and then go to you?
I will patiently wait with my hand up.
That's good. I mean, I think that's fine. We could have a tentative meeting there. It seems unlikely to me that we'll need it, but I don't have an objection to if we schedule a tentative meeting for that date, knowing that we'll very likely end up canceling it.
Well, we may actually end up knowing ahead of time that we're not going to make the 9th. And so we could cancel that and then have the meeting in later April meeting in place to finish up.
Yeah. Tom, does that register any concern on your end if we have a backup
Nope,
date
that's
also
fine.
listed
Yeah.
there?
Yeah,
Okay.
and that gives us a little, it is going to be a heavy lift for the advisory board. So if they get in this and say, we just can't finish our review by that time, that gives us the ability to be a little bit flexible with our advisory boards, because it will be a busy, heavy lift for them in that short time frame.
Yeah. All right. Sounds good. Danny?
Yeah, I just have completely separate comment around our meeting schedule. And it's kind of contingent on the outcome of our next agenda item on here, which is how involved we actually expect ourselves to be in working together on shared policy recommendations. Because if we're ultimately not going to be working on that, and I know we'll be talking about that more in the next agenda item, and we're really just a body that makes recommendations to the county on funding, then I would propose that we meet considerably less than we do, and just meet, quarterly or as needed according to the schedule for funding. Sometimes we have meetings that are super short, kind of like this one today. And then others where we're hoping to dig into some policy related stuff that doesn't really end up going anywhere. So I'm just putting that out there for our consideration, pending the outcome of our conversation of, what else we're working on, just to make good use of everybody's time.
Yeah, I think if it's okay, we could put a pin in that until we discuss the next item. That was something I was planning on talking about too, in the context of our role and sort of calling the question. I think that's probably a good segue to just move on to the next item, unless anyone else has questions about the meeting schedule, which I don't see any. All right. Well, let's move on to item number 8, policy discussion, tenant protections. This is something we added to the work plan previously. That's sort of what spurred this. And maybe I'll just provide a little bit of an intro, and then Tom, can you help fill in the gaps and pull up the document? But to your point, Danny, we've talked a long time now about if we want, what is or RHC's role in terms of policy and development, and do we want it to have a greater role, and sort of haven't really reached a conclusion and have had preliminary talks about does it make sense for us to make recommendations about policy? What does that look like? How does that decision process actually happen? How do we meaningfully involve the advisory boards in that decision-making process, and so on and so forth? So when we were talking about this tenant protections thing that was added to the agenda quite some time ago for us to discuss as a group, that sort of spurred this conversation again. And I do think that like we could have a really great conversation with the group of us here right now about like how tenant protections provide housing stability, reduce future homelessness, and so on and so forth. But I do think it's probably time that we try to like call the question on if we want to meaningfully explore policy recommendation setting as a group, or if we think that's just not the right role for us. And if that's the case, then that's fine. But I do think it warrants us to have a conversation about it. So I think this is probably a good place to do that. And if the answer to that is yes, that we do want to explore it, I think the next question we should talk about here and provide direction on for staff is what is the first step in doing that, which would probably be like a 2 to 3 hour, maybe half day retreat where we actually do figure out those things. So Tom, can you help us open up the discussion document that we talked about, which a lot of this is focused on tenant protections, but I also just want to open up the floor so we can have a discussion about what do folks actually think about, do we actually want to do a retreat where we have conversations about what policy recommendations would look like for us if that was a duty of the body?
Great, thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to share my screen again. And then just to kind of set kind of this conversation a little bit more, is I want to kind of revisit the interlocal agreement as we talk about what is the role of the RHC. And I think, you know, I believe there's general agreement that the RHC is not kind of creating regional policy for jurisdictions. But the ILA, as a reminder, says the primary purpose of the RHC is to leverage resources and partnerships through policies and projects that promote equitable access to safe and affordable housing. And then it goes on and talks about the fund sources. And so, as kind of Michael said, in our work plan, we identified tenant protections as something that we wanted to work on. And when we developed our work plan for 24, early 25, we looked at 2 documents. We did a crosswalk of the housing action plans and saw where there was commonality. And then we also looked at our fair housing assessment and saw where are the opportunities where the RHC, where there's kind of cross-jurisdictional interest. And so tenant protections came up as one under the fair housing assessment of something that there was interest in working on a regional basis. And so the tech team, kind of a month or 2 ago, started saying, okay, it's time. We had this scheduled for kind of early 2025 on our work plan to work on. And we said, okay, well, what does that mean? You know, and given some of the things we've done over the past year, the question really came up at tech team, like, what type of work could the RHC do that would be beneficial to jurisdictions? So wanting to make sure that the work we're doing for you on behalf of the RHC is beneficial to jurisdictions. And, you know, we're a little bit stumped, to be honest, about how far to go. What's the real interest? And so kind of this overarching question that we proposed around gets into this kind of really a bigger picture question around what should the RHC's role be in working through tenant protection issues and policies. You can make that kind of more broadly about just policies in general. And then the tech team came up with these really thought questions. And it's not that we need an answer to all of these questions, but just to stimulate thinking around, you know, are there things that your jurisdictions are currently doing in the realm or planning to do around looking at tenant protections? Is it sharing information and knowing what other jurisdictions are doing? Is that sharing of information beneficial? Or, you know, are you looking at ways of reducing barriers? So really kind of really just some stimulating questions to start the conversation so that if the tech team moves forward, that what we're producing is a benefit and an interest to the jurisdictions. And so that's why we really wanted to just have that conversation to get that direction from this body. So we're, making the best use of our time and resources as we move forward. And then I think this also leads into our question of our work plan, kind of a little bit to Danny's point, is what is our work plan for 2025? And I think before the tech team really feels confident of bringing a work plan to you of what we propose to do 2025, of getting a little bit more clarity around what does kind of collaboration and partnership around policy look like for the REC. So we know what makes sense to work on, what other topics that make sense. So I don't know if that's helpful.
That's very helpful. Thank you, Tom, for filling in all the gaps. I appreciate it. I guess I just want to open it up and kind of get thoughts from folks, which also not limited to members, to staff. If you have thoughts or questions, this is a co-equal space. It's a discussion, so please feel free to jump in, staff, if you also have thoughts and input to share. Carolyn, I see you came off mute.
Oh, didn't mean to, but
well, it's convenient for me to just call on the person who's unmuted,
that's
though.
fine. Yeah. Thinking through that list of questions, Lacey is not contemplating any changes right now in landlord-tenant law. I think, like this organization and many others, there's a great sensitivity to staff workload. We're all under budget constraints. I mean, luckily, I don't think we're facing layoffs, but we have expanding work with the same staff, and that means there's a lot of sensitivity to taking on new things. So I would imagine that our and I'm speaking for myself as a council member, I can't speak for the whole council, but I think we would be more comfortable not taking on a draft policy making to be shared among the jurisdictions role. I think there's still interest in if a jurisdiction develops policy that could be shared with the other jurisdictions, that there would be interest in trying to make sure that happens. Anything that we do, I'm sure we would be most happy to do and eager to also be recipients of the work that others do. And I don't mean to put that back in silos so much, but it's kind of the reality of where we are, both with staff bandwidth and looking at the other priorities. I mean, Lacey's big priority right now is doing everything we can to get more housing particularly in the affordable range and low income range. And so that's kind of where our staff is putting its big focus.
So you're interested in this group sort of retaining kind of the historical role of, if one jurisdiction on its own acts independently with some sort of policy enactment, that could be shared in terms of a forum, but not having recommendations sort of originate that jurisdictions could then go back and contemplate after the fact.
Right. I mean, I think if an issue came up, I would, perhaps we could propose to the jurisdictions that policy needs to be developed around this, and perhaps we could have a special meeting or something to try to craft something that could be shared out. But as a regular originator of policy, I'm just not sure we've got the bandwidth, and I know our tech team is really stretched as well. So.
And I see a few hands. I think the first one I saw was Carolina. Sorry, I almost called you Carolina, like the state. Incorrect.
That's usually how I tell people to spell my name. Okay. I have I think I have a lot of thoughts about this. For me, I think that the concept of the Regional Housing Council, right, was for it to become a policy body, and so I'm still kind of stuck on that. But I know that we are all separate entities, right? And maybe one policy does not really fit within our jurisdictions, and so I understand that piece. But I also want us to have some considerations, especially like the mold. I'll use the mold one, for example, right? Like that is something that is of interest to everyone. It is something that we all want to tackle. And so then is there like another avenue where instead of jumping through each jurisdiction, maybe we do form a subcommittee and do a formal recommendation to another body, like the Board of Health, right? Like where they have this more of this countywide authority. And not saying that the Board of Health can take every policy issue, but I think that there are things that we can work on with policy that might not be, big, heavy things, but we can start with some items where we can start creating an avenue, because I just don't want the Regional Housing Council to just be a funding mechanism. I think that there is capacity here, especially with the two groups, advisory groups that we've created. There's this cohesiveness that I think we could really tap into more, and really pass some really good policy across the county. So those are just my initial thoughts on this conversation.
Great, thank you. I think I saw Darian next before Danny.
Yeah, thanks for asking for staff, Michael. I appreciate it. Yeah, I just wanted to comment on experience that I'm having with the tech team right now, and it just feels like we're struggling on what to do. And so we are feeling like with the advisory boards and then with our HC, we don't really have a place because we have just become a funding mechanism. And if we're not prioritizing grant collaboration, if we're not prioritizing policy, we're not really feeling what our role is at this time. And so I feel like there is capacity in our tech teamwork to do this. But right now, if we remain as a funding mechanism, as you can see, your RHC agendas have become super light because we're not bringing meat forward for you all to discuss, because we just can't. We don't have policy discussions, even as you see for our affordable housing incentives that the tech team spent a bunch of time putting together. What came of that? So when we do work on projects, it feels like they come to the RHC at this level to kind of like we're confused on what comes out of them. And in the past handful of grants that have come forward, there hasn't been a bite to do some thoughtful collaboration. So I just want to note, from a staff perspective, we're experiencing a lot of confusion on what we even do, what the RHC really even does. Why not just have the advisory boards make recommendations to the BOCC at that point? And what really is the body doing? Just to share a staff perspective.
Thank you. And thank you for your candidness too. I think it's really helpful that we get input from everyone. So I really appreciate you sharing that with us. Danny?
Yeah, I mean, I feel confused as an RHC member in terms of our role here. And, I want to read the other part of the ILA that I think is causing this confusion, which is right below the part where it talks about our primary purpose. There's the section B, and it says, additionally, the RHC may provide a forum for consideration of policy options related to homelessness and to encourage development of regional approaches to planning for, responding to, and funding homeless services and facilities and expanding affordable housing options. So my read on that is that we are enabled to be that forum for policy consideration, and that we should be able to, as we agree as the RHC, be able to work on things. But I feel like it comes in like fits and stops. Like, we decide we want to work on something and then nothing comes of it. And then I've also, one thing that I've noticed or just have observed is that other bodies will look to us, like with the grants pass decision. I know there was a meeting of the 3 cities and they're like, oh, the Regional Housing Council should work on this. So there's like an expectation from others that we are working on it. Yet I also know that there was a meeting of like city managers and the county manager to say, oh, should the RHC be working on policy that I heard about, after the fact. So there's all this discussion going on about what we should be doing and shouldn't be doing that I'm not even part of those conversations. So I feel a lot of confusion. And I would say that, I don't want us working on policy recommendations where, in Olympia, we're working on tenant protections. We don't really need guidance from other jurisdictions. I think the ideal would be is if we're all interested in working on it and wanting to be aligned in it, then great. But that doesn't sound like the case for that one. Maybe the issue of mold, as Carolina mentioned, is something where there is something that can be worked on, but I don't want us to spin our wheels anymore on this. Like, if we could, just get clear, like either we work on policy or we don't. And if we don't, then let's, take a look at our work plan and chop a whole bunch of stuff off there so that we can save some time for staff and for ourselves. And if we are going to work on the policy stuff, what are the things that we all want to work on together? Which sounds like there's if we can narrow that down and get very clear, I think that that would at least help us know what to do next. That being said, we did just vote on our legislative agenda, and that is policy work right there.
Yeah. Emily, I see you have your hand raised. I candidly am not aware of what limitations to your role exist at the moment. I think I'll use my discretion and offer to feel free to make a comment, I believe, if it's directed at us as members. If you have questions for staff, then please put those in writing, and I apologize if I am not following a rule of some kind that I'm unaware of.
I appreciate you trying to be flexible. I will continue to ask questions and share thoughts in meetings. That's been the norm in all of my other meetings, and I think to silence a member of the RHC would probably take a vote. I'm not quite sure, but I'm still going to speak up when I have questions. Right now, I just wanted to kind of echo what Councilmember Madrone is saying. And it's humbling to hear others say that they are confused about the process as well. I know this policy conversation has been ongoing for quite a while, and I hear a lot of stuff that sounds really promising, especially when Councilmember Madrone references the ILA, which does mention policy. So I would be interested in the idea of having a retreat to kind of like iron some of this stuff out, because I think there's a lot of good energy here, and it would be potentially, a waste of an opportunity to really come together and collaborate if we didn't talk about this a little bit more when there is some interest. So that's just kind of where I'm at with it.
Thank you. Carolyn?
Well, one other thing I think we ought to consider is the evolution, of the Regional Housing Council, and how I hate to just beat a dead horse, but how we literally started out as an ad hoc committee, and then we became a formal organization. And there is future thought toward becoming a more independent agency with, of course, ties to the county. But I don't know, my thinking is kind of getting to that next hurdle would liberate this group more to be more focused on policy, given the time constraints on staff and all that I've previously alluded to. So I'm not saying totally kick the can down the road, but I think this needs to be a part of that conversation as in terms of where we're going.
Yeah, I think that sort of speaks to some of the concerns about resources that the individual jurisdictions have to contribute to these discussions, which is something that we feel very strongly about as well too. Those are concerns that we also share in terms of capacity of our local staff to take on new projects. Tom, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I appreciate all those comments. I think from my perspective, right, I think there's two issues. One is kind of the upfront staff work, for the RHC in terms of the work plan and the capacity. And I think it's fair to say the county and perhaps City of Olympia have a little bit more staff capacity than Lacey and Tumwater and Yelm. And I think understand that challenge and happy to kind of talk through that. So I think that upfront staff capacity is one issue. But I think there's also a question is, okay, after the tech team does its work and then the RHC blesses whatever the tech team does, then what's next? And I think that's also been kind of a point of kind of confusion of what kind of happens after it leaves the RHC and goes back to the jurisdictions. That also seems a point where additional kind of clarity of, who takes responsibility for that and how that kind of goes and moves through the jurisdictions, whether they act on that or not. So I think there's both the upfront capacity, but then what happens after that work is done is also a question.
Yeah, those are really great points too. Danny, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to speak to the issue of staff capacity because both, as Tom said, both Olympia and the county have greater capacity because we have funding through the home fund for staff. And I don't know what the needs are of other jurisdictions, but if we wanted to, we could set aside additional dollars for the other jurisdictions to have additional capacity for staff, even a whole nother person, if that's what's needed. And I think that would help not just with regional approaches to homelessness and housing and the policy side of things, but also when it comes to grant collaboration. We have a lot of opportunities that come up, and I know everybody wants to pitch in and be a part of it, but not everybody has capacity to do so. And if we did have that capacity across the region, we would be a lot more competitive to bring more resources into the area for grant applications. So just wanted to put that out there. I think there could be a solution there. But again, Olympia is not one of we all have our capacity issues, but I'd be curious to hear from Lacey, Tumwater, Yelm, if that's something that would be helpful in terms of being able to get past the challenges around capacity.
I'll just offer a quick response and then move over to you, Caroline, if that's okay. In terms of us, I think funding is helpful, but it doesn't create more hours in the day is the challenge, right? If there was funding that, I think to your point, Carolyn, that sort of meant that some of the work got done by an FTE that was like an RHC FTE, I think that could be potentially a game changer. But for our limitations, like funding, I think is definitely a helpful thing, but it's not like a full FTE. So it's, we're not adding another body to the mix, and there's only so many hours in the day for the two staff that we have that work on these issues and also work on, a dozen other things or whatever.
But what if it was enough funding to add a whole nother body to the staff? That's my question there.
Yeah, then I think that could potentially be like a game changer in terms of opening things up for us. I think that would be incredibly helpful. Yeah. Carolina?
Thank you. No, I agree with Danny. And in terms of the funding piece, right, I would like to know, can we afford that? What would that position look like? What would be of the most support? But I also think that as the RHC, there has to be this realistic view as well as to what policy you actually want to address. because that's one of the things that I've noticed is there's these big goals, right? And yet all of a sudden staff are just spinning their wheels, things get brought up, everyone claps here, and then it just doesn't move forward from there. And so, you know, I've been in that same kind of frustration this year, as well as, you know, we've been seeing it. And so as we talk about getting into more policy, I just want to have realistic goals of things that can actually be achievable, instead of setting really big ideas and then there being a lot of just hesitance with moving those policies forward from the other jurisdictions.
Well, what if there's part of, I mean, the other thing we can do is if we do talk about, what if we dedicate a meeting or a couple of hours to talking about the framework for this kind of policy? But part of that discussion isn't just what it could look like. Part of that discussion is, all right, but what would a work plan for year one be if we actually want to sort of take a step in this direction, so that we're speaking in specifics instead of aspirational hypotheticals. Robert?
Thank you. I actually wasn't sure if I was going to say anything, because I'm just as an observer for a fairly short amount of time, and having sat on many policy boards in my tenure, I think on some level, what I keep on coming back to, that there's on some level a structural issue in terms of you know, that it gets back to the purpose of the RHC, but also the authority of the RHC. It truly, in many ways, still continues to be an advisory. It's a council. It advises on predominantly funding recommendations. It advises potentially on policy. But the difficulty there is having, you know, you go through this and you delve into issues, and how you resource them is one of the biggest topics. Who can contribute to that? How does that happen? But ultimately, it feels like, you know, you do some great work and you put it out there, and here's something, and not everybody does it and takes it and runs with it, because there is no prescriptive authority of this body to then determine that some other jurisdiction or a member jurisdiction does something in a particular way. So I think there's always going to be potentially a disconnect between desire and structure to actually implement, if that makes sense.
That does. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing. I think it's really helpful to have everyone's perspective, but especially folks who haven't, you know, been here for I think Carolyn, you and I are some of the founding members, and have been sort of, you know, kind of been wrapped around the axle at times for over the months. Brad?
Yeah, I thank you for the conversation. I think this has touched on a lot of important points, and I just want to reiterate, I think it's important to have an opportunity for the electeds, the staff, and probably the county and city managers to sit down and have a discussion of really where we're going to go now with the RHC, since we started this process in 2020 and are obviously evolving towards something else. And I think that discussion is important because it will sort of focus on the structural things that Robert is bringing up, that I think there are other examples of local regional cooperation that have come out of, you know, some of this pain of how do we actually try to manage on a group level to translate what we're talking about into action by particular jurisdictions and so forth. And I would hold up as an example the Thurston Climate Mitigation Plan groups that have been formed, and the recent ILA that's been there. I think that might be a decent example to consider. There are other examples I think that should be looked at, but there needs to be, in my mind, some mechanism for Obviously, when the RHC and the RHC tech team works on funding recommendations, that's one thing, because that's a finite thing. There's a set expectation of things, and the County Board of Commissioners have bought up on the RHC agreeing that the RHC has a role in providing a recommendation towards that. I don't necessarily think there's been a buy-off on an RHC role from the councils and the rest of the commission on policy-related things. And I think that's part of the hang-up. And I think we need to talk through that and decide on how we resolve that issue. And then from that, I think follows trying to figure out what resources and whether or not we go to some hybrid model for the RHC as a regional entity, or we keep it as this organization and figure out some other means. But I think we need to tackle those larger questions before we think about the staffing side of things.
So I think that I'm sensing some kind of common denominators or themes here. So some of which seems to be an interest in being more than just a body that approves funding decisions. That's sort of a theme that I'm hearing from most folks, is that we can leverage our collective capacity, input, power, interest, thoughts, passion into providing, into doing more than just approving funding decisions. That sort of seems to be a common thread that I'm hearing. But also that we have some direction in the ILA that provides kind of a precedent for the fact that this was always a potential contemplation, but doesn't provide the structure by which it could operate, or that we might have evolved beyond the original ILA that we've already enacted. So it sort of sounds like to me that there are big questions that are probably too big to be answered in one of our monthly meetings. So I guess I would sort of pivot us and ask, does it make sense that we do a half-day meeting in the spring sometime so that we can try to have a forum for these discussions that would also then include our city administrators or managers, potentially our executives, and other individuals, including also probably the advisory boards as well, in revising that role too, in terms of seeing if we want to make them voting members. That's the other thing we've talked about recently as well. So what's folks' interest in trying to set that as a goal maybe for the spring, so we can have those conversations? And if you think that's an idea that won't bear fruit, this is a safe space. Feel free to be candid with your thoughts about that too. So where are folks at on something along those lines?
Well, I don't want to throw cold water on it. I think it's always a good idea for everybody to come to the table, but I think that's a big ask of a large group. In even a half day meeting, I'm wondering if there might be some steps that would lead up to that, so that we had perhaps the city and county managers, have a conversation first, and then, we're having our conversations as a council, and then the advisory groups kind of do their thing, so that we have kind of thought out pieces and proposals to bring to a summit like that.
Carolina?
Thank you. I think maybe I like the idea of bringing everyone, right? Because if you're all there together, then you're all hearing the same information at the same time. If it's a scheduling issue or a huge time commitment issue, I understand that. Maybe splitting it up, maybe having just the county and city managers there for a period of time, and then discuss some, semblance with them, and then have members of the advisory boards at a different time. But I just think that we need to have this discussion, and I just don't want to continue to be in the same situation, same time next year. So I really would love to kind of give that direction to staff as well, right, on where is it that the RHC is going, and you know, if we are just going to be a funding organization, then at that time, right, like just accept that and start creating dreams of being a policy-based body.
Danny?
Yeah, I agree with Carolina. I'm already like, I wouldn't want to have like all these separate meetings that happen and then we all come together for a big meeting, because that's already been happening and it's not working. I also, like, you know, I wouldn't want like the city and county managers to come together and talk about what they think the role that RIC should have without us. You know, we have the ILA here to guide us. And if there's something that's not clear in that, which obviously is the case, then we all need to discuss it together. Because we represent our jurisdictions, like that's our role. And so I wouldn't want to be removed from that conversation in any way. And I'd rather us all have it together up front. My request would be that if we do this, that it be like late enough in the spring that session is over, and to guarantee availability. Yeah, I mean, I would welcome a conversation where we get everybody who's talking this in the room and on the same page. And at the end of the day, it's not a good idea for us to work on policy together. Then as Carolina said, then let's let it go. And save the workload for everybody. But the desire is obviously here to try to figure something out. So if something can be done, then let's figure it out. But we'll only be able to do that with everybody in the room.
I wasn't suggesting that everybody wouldn't be in the room, and perhaps I wasn't being clear in what I was talking about. I'm just thinking, we've got to have some order to put to it so that everybody, we have a clear agenda, and at least some assumptions going into this about, what it is we're there to figure out. We have some thought out proposals on the table. Otherwise, with that big a group, it's really hard. I mean, you'd have to have a pretty good facilitator there in order to walk out the door with a big decision with a bow tied around it.
We could also have like a subcommittee that could help with planning, that can help work on an agenda in advance and would report back to this group at monthly meetings so that we know kind of what is happening with the subcommittee, not to create more work, but Tom?
Well,
oh, sorry. Finish your thought, Carolyn. Sorry. I didn't mean to.
Well, I was just going to say, if we're going to put all the work into having a meeting, I want it to be a successful meeting and make good use of everybody's time and effort.
Yeah. Tom?
Yeah, and not to kind of get too far into the weeds too quickly, but I think that is a key question for a big meeting like this with some really key fundamental questions. Do think about, whether that means hiring a facilitator, and if that's something we need to, even if we're doing something in kind of late spring, that means starting now to kind of find that facilitator to bring that, or if we think that's something that we can do in-house, if we have someone. I'm looking at Rob, if there's anyone that in-house who could facilitate that conversation, because I do agree with Carolyn that coming to that meeting, even if it's 3 hours, half a day, with that big of a group, will really need to be focused with some good preparation for that to be effective. My first thought is, okay, who's going to facilitate this, and how do we kind of build that agenda? And whether we need to kind of start thinking about developing that scope of work for an outside facilitator to find someone to do that, or if that's something that can be done kind of in-house, so to speak.
I would assume we would probably want a facilitator. We did have a facilitator our last RHC retreat. That was the one day, which I want to say it was like 2021 or something like that. And
yeah, it was 2 half days or two full days.
Oh, was it? Yeah, 2 full days. And I think that was helpful. It would also, if we only do a half day, that would be considerably cheaper, I would think, than what we've done in the past. Though that would mean jurisdictions would probably contribute a teeny bit to help defer those costs, which I talked to my mayor and she said it was cool. So I don't know. I'm cool writing the blank check, but no, I'm just kidding.
Well, Lacey had a new facilitator for our retreat last year, and she is fantastic. We're going to have her back at our next retreat in January. So if anybody's interested, I'd be glad to chase down her contact information and kind of see what her price range is and all. But I mean, she's fun. She's not heavy-handed, but she's right there if, you know, things start going sideways. She's right there to put it straight. And just, she did a marvelous job with our retreat. I was really happy with her. And she asks a lot of good questions beforehand to kind of get to know the individuals and kind of what's on people's minds and also.
That's great. We might have to hit you up for a reference. But so it does, I am sort of hearing a bit of a consensus emerge. Folks are interested in coming together and maybe doing a half day in the late spring, sometime after the first session concludes. I won't say the only session because I'm incredibly superstitious. So after regular session concludes, which I'm sure will not be extended. So that's what I'm hearing in terms of sort of a consensus, that there seems to be interest from folks in having a conversation like that, maybe a half day where we try to pool some funds to provide a facilitator. Okay. I'm seeing head nods. Okay. All right. I'm not, to be frank, I'm not really sure what the next steps are, but maybe we can kind of iron a few more things out at the next meeting. Tom, do you think it's a realistic goal to try to decide maybe at the next meeting, do we want a facilitator, and maybe this is what the date is? Like we won't be able to come up with scope and specific issues by that point in time, by the next RHC meeting, but
we can bring some stuff forward for you kind of to move the conversation forward.
Okay.
Try to pin down the date and maybe a plan for next steps.
Okay. Great. And members, I guess in the meantime, if we all sort of talk to our respective mayors and city administrators and executives, in the meantime, that to sort of lay the foundation for that, I guess that's a next step for us.
And I'll look, sorry, I will look at our budget to see if whether within our local home fund admin, we may, without making any promises, we may be able to cover the cost for the facilitator out the local home fund administrative dollars.
Great. Carolina?
Would it also be too much to ask to see, you know, if we're going to be discussing a staffing for a new staff person, can we get the numbers on what that would look like as well, and funding availability?
Yeah, I'll dive in. I can do a little bit on
probably
our end.
I'm probably jumping ahead, and this might be a better retreat question, but I just, you know, I think if the need's going to be there, having that information is good for the board.
And were we talking about one individual who would be shared with Lacey, Tumwater, and Yelm?
I think we're still early in that, what that could potentially look like. I'm not sure we have answers to any of that quite yet.
Right, just.
Yeah. Gary?
Okay.
Okay. Oh God. Sorry. Bad lighting. Well, I just, okay. You invited staff comments.
I did.
I found this conversation to be extremely nebulous. I'm still kind of trying to figure out what it is that this conversation would be. On the one hand, I really like, of course, I would like, you know, Danny's suggestion that we could beef up some staffing to help with, you know, Yelm, you know, which I've said a zillion times, we don't have a housing program. So we're often behind the curve when some of these initiatives come about. So that's fantastic, but that's staffing. But the question about policy, and whether we would just, the RHC would just be a funding entity versus a policy entity. What I'm wondering is, what do you mean by that? Do you mean a regional policy authority? I mean, and I guess I would like to see like 3 problems that aren't getting solved, aren't getting traction, and how they would be solved if we did something else. And right now, it's, to me, it's, I definitely recognize and appreciate all the comments from Darian and from Brad and others. I mean, I know everybody's on the point that there's a little bit of a spinning of the wheels going on, but I'm not quite seeing what the actual, and I realize it's an extremely sensitive topic to say we want to have more authority to make decisions in a regional way, but is that what we're talking about?
So that's not necessarily how I sort of envision this. I don't think we're talking about, do the jurisdictions want to give lawmaking authority to the RHC? I don't think that's the scope of what we're talking about, because I mean, frankly, I don't think any of the jurisdictions would agree to do that. I mean, I know mine wouldn't. So I don't think that's what we're talking about. I think more of what we're talking about are there areas where it makes sense to collaborate regionally, where the RHC can provide guidance to jurisdictions about, this is what a model policy could look like. Like, you can customize this as you see fit to your jurisdiction if you want to. But this is an example of something where this is what the city is doing and it makes sense. Like, if I'm looking at, Darian brought up kind of the affordable housing matrix, and how we put it on the website, or we're going to put it on the website. That's in the communications plan. But like, if I were to try to think of a way in which that tool could be more useful, it would be looking at different policies that are across jurisdictional lines and kind of forming what I would say would be like an RHC recommendation about a policy that a jurisdictional member, like one of us, could take back to our jurisdictions, and we could then work on legislation within that jurisdiction. And I think one of the examples that comes to mind for me that's similar to that was when I don't know if Yelm did, but I know Lacey, Olympia, Tumwater, and the county took action on the private pet businesses, on pet sales. The Joint Animal Services created a recommendation and sent a letter that was like, we think that this policy would be good for the welfare of animals across jurisdictional lines. And it was a policy that Olympia had adopted before the other jurisdictions had. And because it was coming from a position of expertise within JASCOM, that sort of, I think, lent a lot of credibility and political weight, and was helpful for the jurisdictions in being able to enter a legislative process with some expertise and that recommendation already in hand. And we were able to achieve a unanimous policy across jurisdictional lines, so that when a private dog store closed in Olympia, it didn't then just move to Tumwater. It didn't then just shift elsewhere. So I think there's like some ways to look at this, but I don't really envision anyone really agreeing to disperse their power to a regional authority in that sense. Go ahead. You don't need to raise your hand. You just keep talking. I'm sorry. The mailman's here, so my dog is like really upset. Apologies.
Okay, just a brief reply. So that's, I mean, I suspected that was not the case. I've actually worked Olympia, Lacey, Tumwater, and Thurston County, and I knew that nobody was going to want to cede local control, but I was just trying to figure out exactly how what we were looking at, and it really reinforces my support for kind of what Danny was saying, and in terms of Yelm, speaking for Yelm, having more capacity to work on things that we can agree on for like model ordinances and policies. I don't think that we've really ever had much issue with trying to forward those kinds of initiatives that we could work on regionally that could work for all of us. So I don't know if that differs with Brad and that he wanted policy before staff, but I think for a Yelm anyway, staff might be the thing we need first. That's all. Thanks.
Yeah, and to sort of answer your other point, I think that all of us coming together would be putting planning before either of those things so that we can develop consensus and sort of plan what some of these things could potentially look like. Well, it sounds like we have some direction for a couple preliminary sort of thoughts and deliverables for the next meeting. So I'll move us along in the agenda unless there's any sort of final thoughts on this one item that anyone else wanted to share. All right, I don't see any of that. That brings us sort of to the end, except we do have good of the order. I don't think I have anything from my neck of the woods, but Brad, feel free to correct me if I'm not remembering anything specific, but does anyone else have any good of the order to share?
Tom?
Carolyn, I think I saw you raise a hand.
Yeah,
A physical one, not like
I
a little
thought-
yellow one in the corner of the screen. But
Yeah, I thought Carolina was asking Tom to say something there, so that's why I hesitated. We are on the eve of a big announcement. At the lot meeting tonight, lot is going to decide on the price of a 5-acre tract in Lacey, which Lacey is prepared to buy and then work with the housing authority to develop 62 cottage units. This is across from Camachin Middle School on Mullen Road. And it would serve seniors and I think families with children kind of thing. And so I'm very hopeful that we can make this happen because it's desperately needed and we just need to work out the money. And I think we've got a good path forward. So think good thoughts and hopefully it'll come to pass.
that's great. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
It's across the street from my alma mater. Do people say that about middle schools? I don't know. All right. Thank you. And any other good of the order? All right. Seeing none, we'll get a few minutes back. Thanks everyone for the robust discussion. I think it was a really good discussion and I'm excited for our next steps. All right. Thanks folks. We're adjourned.
Thanks. Bye everybody.